little ground rules. We will start with Jeremy providing a bit of a presentation about the region, giving us a bit of historical context. And then after that, Jonathan will provide some feedback and some response and talk about some notable things from Jeremy's presentation and perhaps add a bit more context to the conversation. And then from there, we just really want this to be sort of a discussion where people can pose questions and we can really hopefully at the end of this come out with a greater understanding, not just of the historical context, the present day conflict, and what those of us who are in various leadership roles can do to add our voice to the conversation of trying to achieve longstanding peace and stability in that region of the world. So with that, I think it's appropriate now for me to just hand that off to you. Jeremy, I know there's a map that I was supposed to share, so let me see if I can pull that up here.
Yeah, and if not, it's not a big deal. Don't worry about it. That was a great introduction, Laolu. Thank you. I'll just get started. I know we have a limited amount of time, and I really want the discussion. I think it's more important than ever that we as local leaders, as civic leaders, are engaged in discussion, because these issues don't get better unless we talk about them, as hard as it is sometimes to talk about them. And I also feel, as a professor, it's important that we model civic conversation, because certainly our students, young people, are not seeing it on TV. They're not seeing it in Congress. So we better, one way or another, model it for them. I'll also say, and I'm sure Jonathan will chime in on this too, this is an incredibly complex issue, an incredibly complex region. And no matter how much you study it, there's always more to learn. And so I am not talking to you as the all-seeing expert. There's a lot I don't know. I'm sure there are things Jonathan knows that I don't know. And this is the kind of issue that you can keep studying it and keep learning new things. So there's no canon of official knowledge on this. I am Jewish myself. My mother's the child of Russian Jewish immigrants who came fleeing pogroms. My father's actually an immigrant from India, as I was telling Laolu yesterday. So I'm mixed myself. I've spent a fair amount of time in the region, studying the region as a scholar. As many of you know, the Israeli Academy is very well connected to the U.S. Academy, just as the Israeli tech industry is very well connected to the U.S. tech industry. So I have three topics I want to put on the table, right? We could do a whole course on the history of these issues. There's three historical topics that I think are relevant for understanding how we came to today and where we might go forward from today. One, I want to talk about the history of the region in what I'll call the period of empires, which would be the period through World War II, when this region, the region we're focused on now, Israel, Gaza, Egypt, Jordan, much of that region was under the direct or indirect control of empires. We wouldn't have referred to it as a region of nations in the late 19th, even in the early 20th century. I want to talk about that period a little bit and some myths about that period. Then I want to talk about how nations were formed, and land and nation issues. And then the third thing I want to do is talk about politics. What I want to put overall for what I'm saying is it is wrong to think that Israelis or Jews and Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims have always been at war with one another. That is not true. We have this image that this is a region that has primordial conflict, and that argument is used on both sides, right? Hamas is saying Jews have always hated Arabs and Muslims, so we have to kill them. And some Jews say something like that in reverse. These are minority voices, but they're often powerful voices because people can buy into that my enemy today has always been my enemy. This is not true. This region has gone through a lot of change. And this is my thesis in a sense. The problems we see today are not problems that are inherent to this region. They're accumulated problems over time because of decisions people have made, decisions we can revisit. They're hard to revisit, but they're decisions that we can revisit. This is why we all need to study history. This is why every leader I've ever studied gets more interested in history when they get into a leadership position, because history helps you to see the choices others have made before you. Not so you can play Monday morning quarterback, but so you can revisit those choices in another time. What was a good idea 40 years ago might not be a good idea today. And what wasn't a good idea 40 years ago might be an idea worth revisiting today. So let's begin by talking about the period of empires. The region that we are looking at today, where the war is happening today, was initially, well, I mean, we could go back very far, but let's say in the 18th and 19th century, was largely under Ottoman control. And there's a wonderful map that Laolu has put up here. Much of what you're seeing here, as Israel, as Jordan, as Syria, as Saudi Arabia, this was not identified in that way. These were, going back far enough, these were provinces of the Roman Empire. But in the modern world, right, where our interest really starts, in the 18th and 19th century, for most of that period, this region was under the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire was ruled from Istanbul or Constantinople, and gave a fair amount of autonomy to its provinces. It was not racially or religiously equal, but it was not religiously totalitarian either. There was a fair amount of autonomy for the different regions. And the relatively small Jewish population that was living around the holy sites here, as well as the relatively small Muslim population that was living around the holy sites, as well as the Christian, and there was also, by the way, a Zoroastrian population. All of those populations, it's not that they didn't have conflicts, but they were not at war with one another. In fact, there was a great deal of intermarriage. This is really interesting. Bernard Lewis and others have studied this. In the 19th century, there's actually a fair amount of intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews in this region. You see vestiges of that if any of you remember or traveled to Lebanon in the 1970s before the Lebanese Civil War. Lebanon is a society that through the 70s, through the time of the Civil War, still manifested a lot of intermixing. Similar to what we would have said about Sarajevo before the Yugoslav War. This area paid tribute to the Ottoman Empire. The religious sites were largely protected by the empire. I'm not making this sound like some golden age. I hope there were issues. Of course, Jews were not treated as first-class citizens, but they had certain rights within the empire, as did Muslims, as did Christians, and you had thriving communities in this area. There's a wonderful show I recommend to all of you. My family's been watching it recently. It's on Netflix. It's called Beauty Queen of Jerusalem. And it captures the Jerusalem, it's an Israeli show, of the late 19th and early 20th century. Here are some interesting facts that you might not know. One of the most popular languages that Jews spoke in this region was Ladino, which is actually a Sephardic mix of Spanish and Hebrew. Yiddish, of course, was spoken more in Northern Europe, but it was beginning, it had some presence. The Sephardim, Southern European Jews, were the larger number in this area, and Orthodox Jews. They were not Zionists. In fact, they remained non-Zionists through most of the 19th century, even with beginning discussions about Zion, because they saw themselves as part of an empire. Now, with the recession of the Ottoman Empire in the mid to late 19th century, the British moved into this area. And this map is super helpful because the British moved into this area not because they had any interest in particularly managing Muslim and Christian and Jewish populations. They moved into this area because of the importance of Egypt and the Suez Canal, which was built by the British, actually French engineers, then taken over by the British. And the Suez Canal provided the key transportation route between the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian Ocean, the key transportation route for getting goods from the East Indies, from India and elsewhere, into the European markets. The British were in this area to protect India and to protect Egypt. Egypt was nominally independent, but it was under British suzerainty. Muhammad Ali, who was actually the leader of Egypt in the late 19th century, was technically the leader of Egypt, but he paid deference to the British Empire. The British were concerned about this area primarily because they wanted to keep this area out of the hands of their enemies, the French or the Russians, or what was left of the Ottoman Empire. And this became significant during World War I. This became very significant during World War I. Because during World War I, the Ottoman Empire, as most of you know, before it collapsed, it joined the Germans and the Austrians. And the British wanted to make sure this area, the resources, the people in this area, were not used by their enemies. This is where we get to the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration, which was issued by Arthur Balfour at the end of World War I. It was a promise of a Jewish homeland. He was doing that, Balfour was, for some religious reasons. He was a dispensationalist who believed that Christ would come again when the Jews were back in Israel. But actually, the real reason he did that was a promise to Jews to keep them on the British side. The British also made a promise to the Muslims. And in fact, the French did that as well. Both sides received promises of possibilities living in this area. If we stopped our history in 1920, the year after the Versailles settlement, the year after the end of World War I, we would find that this area was still dominated by Sephardic Jews and Muslims, who were mostly nomadic, would come into the area. And you would have actually very few of what we think of as white Jews in this area, and very few of what we think of as non-nomadic Muslim populations in this area. And if you watch that show, The Beauty Queen of Jerusalem, it actually captures this. The real issues are between different Jewish communities and British authority in this region. Zionism was popular with some Jews, but it was very unpopular with others. And this was not necessarily a destination for Muslims. The holy sites were there. The holy sites were there that Muslims made Hajj to, that Jews would want to visit. American Jews from the late 19th century were taking trips to go to Jerusalem. Mark Twain wrote about this. If you've read his wonderful travelogue, Innocents Abroad, he writes about American Christians and Jews going to Jerusalem. So this was a place people were visiting, but it wasn't a destination. It wasn't an area really being fought about. It was actually an area being managed by imperial powers and conflicts within them. The problem really arises with World War II as Britain consolidates its power in this region, as Britain seeks to, again, win over Jewish support for the British cause, as well as Muslim support for the British cause. The British are in large control now of the largest empire they've ever controlled in the 1930s, including many Islamic areas, including Iraq. The British create Iraq. Right? They put together the different parts of Iraq, for example. They manage the oil in the region. The United States is a secondary player in a lot of this, right? And the British are seeking to manage this. And that's where we really get into, I think, the first shift from that first point I wanted to talk about, which I have, empire to land and nation. Coming out of World War II, the conventional wisdom becomes, for Jews and non-Jews, that if you're going to survive, you need a state. You need a nation state. This was a debate among Jews in Herzl's time, in Theodore Herzl's time. This was a debate in the 1920s and 30s. I wrote a whole book on Henry Kissinger. Do you know Henry Kissinger's father was an anti-Zionist? Henry Kissinger grew up in Germany. His father was a German Jew, and like many other German Jews, he thought he was German. The last thing he wanted to do was go to Israel. The only reason the family came to the U.S. was because of the Holocaust. Right? Henry Kissinger's maternal grandparents were killed at Bergen-Belsen, in fact. So the notion of creating a Jewish state was not something inevitable, and the notion of creating a Muslim state was not something inevitable before World War II. World War II is the catalyst, right? Because the lesson from World War II, and I think the correct lesson, right, is if you're going to survive as a minority people, you need your own state. What's the problem the Jews have? What's the problem the Roma have? What's the problem various other groups have? What's the problem that many Chinese have in Asia? They don't have a state that can defend them. And in a world with modern warfare and an incentive for large states, industrializing states, to take more territory and push people off the territory, what we come to call ethnic cleansing and genocide, the best protection you have, right, is to have a state. It's harder to think of yourself, for obvious reasons, as a German Jew after 1939, right? Much, much harder to think of yourself in that way, or as an Austrian Jew, whatever else. So that becomes a catalytic factor. And there's a second issue that's often forgotten by Americans. At the end of the war, you have very, very large number of what are called DPs, displaced people. Those who were Jewish and non-Jewish who can't go back to their homes. I want to give you just a very direct personal example of this. This summer, we went to Auschwitz again. We've been a number of times. I always think it's important to go and see these sites. It's not pleasant if you've gone, but it's important to see with your own eyes so no one can deny. And We took our son. Our daughter was working in Washington, so she wasn't able to come. We took our son to Auschwitz, and we also stayed in Krakow, historic, beautiful medieval city in Poland that's right near Krakow. There were about 12,000 Jews who survived Auschwitz, believe it or not. Most of them couldn't even go back to Krakow. Those who went back to Krakow were attacked. There was a pogrom in Krakow after the war, and Jews were killed who went back to Krakow. So they couldn't go back. They couldn't go back to where they were. Non-Jewish Germans couldn't go back to the homes they were in Poland either. And the United States, to be frank, did not want to take in all these Jews. In fact, many were turned away. So the notion of an Israeli, of a Jewish state, and the notion of Muslim states, in some ways came out of World War II, and the recognition that you needed a state for your protection, and second, that it was a place people could go so we wouldn't have to take them. Right? Here's the irony. The Holocaust succeeds. It gets many of the Jews out of Europe. What did Hitler want? Right? He wanted Lebensraum. He wanted to remove Jews from Europe. And a very, very large proportion of them leave the state. The same thing, Laolu knows more about this than I do, happens in Africa. As you see a sorting of peoples being pushed out of different countries, you get more homogeneous nation states after World War II. This is what the fight is about in Eastern Europe. Why you need a Czech state and a Slovak state and a Hungarian state and an Austrian state. Those were all part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This was all part of the Ottoman or the British Empire, and now you get separate statehood. In 1947, the United Nations agrees to create a Jewish state and to create an Arab state, an Arab Muslim state in some of this territory around the Holy Lands, creating an international city around the holiest of the Holy Lands. And then in 1948, the State of Israel is created, recognized by the United States almost immediately, but it finds itself at war, Israel does, as do the states around it. And why? In part, it's because the states around it did not want to recognize its existence. And there's no way of getting beyond that they attacked Israel from the day it was born. There's no way of getting around that. That's just a fact. But by the same token, it's also important to say that the Israeli state was founded on the belief that there would be a space for Jews that would be primarily for Jews, and there were many non-Jews living there. The vision of the state that David Ben-Gurion had was that it would be accepting of all people, but it was still going to be a Jewish state, and you had large numbers of non-Jews who were on this land. And we could then go through all the wars since then. But that becomes, if the period of empire was a period of intermixing without statehood, period after World War II is a conflict over land and state. The way I try to explain this to my undergrads, it's the opposite of Texas history. It's the exact opposite of our history, because Texas is a land surplus state. There's always more land, even today, right, for someone to go and find, right? And so we deal with, Frederick Jackson Turner wrote about this in the early 20th century, right? We deal in the United States by solving our problems by making the pie bigger, right? There's more land. Go somewhere else and find more land and build your company and do whatever you do. That's why many people came to Texas. Texas in the 19th century is one of the few states where women could buy and own land. So you have all these New York State heiresses who come to Texas in the 1860s and 70s because Texas still had Mexican land ownership laws, which allowed women to own land. They couldn't own land in New York. So they took their wealth from New York and came to Texas. Just one example of that. Look at all the immigrants who have come and done amazing things. I mean, Sam Houston himself, an immigrant from another part of the country, right? So we have land surplus that we can move people into. This space, this is why the map's so important, it doesn't, right? Gaza, just to put this in perspective, Gaza is about the size of Manhattan, slightly larger. Gaza is about the size of Manhattan. There are many, many Israels in Texas. I don't know how many, but hundreds we could fit into our enormous state. Now let's talk about politics. So we talked about empire, we've talked about land. Let's talk about politics. The issues become very difficult to solve because there's not enough land. And the truth of the matter is it becomes a lot easier for politicians to mobilize people to fight than to compromise. That's not a new phenomenon. That's an old phenomenon. Particularly true for the Arab states. Many of these states around Israel are states that have a lot of trouble managing themselves. They have all kinds of internal difficulties. Saudi Arabia is not even really a state. It's a family that owns the oil and controls this large desert space. They have their own internal problems. And it's much easier to have an external enemy and to foment violence around an external enemy than it is to solve your problems. This is not a cultural phenomenon. We see this in the US too, right? It's very easy to use an enemy rather than to solve a problem. And Jews are an obvious and easy enemy. There's a long tradition of anti-Semitism that can be used. This is always, again, what I tell my students, right? Anytime there's someone who wants to use hate for political purposes, Jews are usually a convenient victim. That's why we should always be careful as Jews about anyone who is a demagogue of hate. Because even if they're not coming at us now, they'll come at us eventually. That's the historical record, because we're small people compared to other larger populations. So we're always vulnerable. We're always easy to attack. We're always easy to identify, right? We're physically easy to identify because of what we do after a boy is born, right? There are all kinds of ways to find who we are. This is a convenient political entity. I really want to hit that point. I don't think it's that the Muslim world all of a sudden becomes more anti-Jewish. You could talk about historical conflict between religions, but they had lived together reasonably peacefully, as I pointed out, in the 19th century. It's the politics of this. It's the usefulness for the Saudi kingdom until recently to say, look, we're good Muslims, even though we're oppressing Muslim people because we're attacking Jews. It's easy. It's helpful for the Assad family in Syria, who are terrible, failed dictators, right? To say, look, we're good Muslims because we're attacking the Jews. So it becomes an easy scapegoat time and time again. What has happened in the Israeli side, and Jonathan might disagree with me on this now, what has happened on the Israeli side is what often happens in conflict is that you start to mirror your enemy. Not all, not most Israelis. Israel is a democracy. None of the states around it are democracies. Israel is a vibrant capitalist country. None of the states are that. So there's no moral equivalence here. But what has happened is that in response, understandable response to the violence and hatred around Israel, Jews have adopted their own justification for this kind of behavior. And this is most evident in the settler community in Israel, which is the community that occupies much of the West Bank on the Israeli side. These are Jews who have been moved into territory that Israel acquired in defending itself in wars after 1948. Territory that the international community does not recognize as Israeli territory. We don't have to get into a debate over who should have that territory. The facts of the matter are that people move into that territory. They're settlers. We have that experience in the US. Settlers are often very militaristic about those around them who are not part of their community because they feel threatened, and they are, but also because it defines who they are. Settlers in Israel now are a very large population. They make up an important part of some of the small political parties that in the makeup of the Knesset have a great deal of influence in putting together or serving in coalitions or not. Benjamin Netanyahu would not be prime minister if it weren't for the settler voters and their role in certain extreme parties there. And they encourage a certain militaristic policy. It might be justified. That's a point we could talk about. But the fact is they've encouraged a more militaristic policy to these communities around them that are threatening them. And so you've seen an escalation spiral. It escalates fast in some periods. It escalates slowly in others. There have been deep divisions in Israel over the last few years over how to handle this issue, how to handle the divisions among the settler community and the non-settler community in Israel. Cities like Tel Aviv are very liberal, very progressive. The settler areas are very conservative. This won't be unusual to Americans who have, right, the politics of Houston are very different, right, from the politics of rural Texas, right? A lot of differences there. That internal set of debates has actually encouraged at times Netanyahu to be more militaristic, also discouraged efforts at peace. And I think it's fair to say that in the last 5 years or so, there have been few, if any, efforts at peacemaking by the United States, by Israel, or by the Arab states around it. The attack by Hamas was obviously morally abhorrent, unjustifiable, clearly also, I think, unproductive if you really cared about the Palestinians. But we have to understand why Hamas did this, as horrible as it is. They're not irrational. They saw themselves being ignored, and they saw themselves confronting a more militaristic set of Israeli policies. They're more isolated. They were afraid Israel was going to make deals with other Arab states that would undermine Palestinian needs. And Palestinians in Gaza are not living well. They are living as second-class citizens. And so there's no justification for it. But Hamas believed that this was a way to put itself on the map and mobilize people around the world for its cause. And they've kind of done that. Netanyahu and Israel has responded as strongly as possible, which is understandable. The United States would do the same, I think. It's hard. We can't really criticize them for doing what we would do, right? But what we have to ask ourselves is if that's going to make it any better. So my last point is that as a Jew, I feel deeply connected to the Israeli response. I feel Israel must respond. But this whole history leads me to be concerned that this appropriate, understandable, justified response could also be unproductive because it doesn't address the problem. Israel will not eradicate Palestinians. Israel is not going to commit genocide in Gaza. Those people are going to be there, and they are going to be more susceptible to extremist groups like Hamas. And even if Israel dismantles Hamas, that's the word to use, not eradicate. Eradicate is genocidal language. If it dismantles, just as we dismantled Al-Qaeda, if they dismantle Hamas, we know there'll be another group that will rise again. And there are too many countries around that area that support that. So there's got to be something more than just a military response. I'm not criticizing it, but I'm saying there's got to be something more. And I think this history helps because we've got to go back to a world like the 19th century where we can have people living together again. And we've got to adjust our politics to that. I'll be very clear. I am not a supporter of Benjamin Netanyahu. I'm a supporter of Israel, but I'm not a supporter of Benjamin Netanyahu because I think he's playing these nationalist politics that I think in the long run undermine Israel. The dream of Israel, the dream of peace, I think it's the Jewish cosmopolitan dream, right? Is that people in the 19th century mode can be who they are and can still live together. And that's actually what most of the people in the region want. And so we need fundamental political change. It's actually not that dissimilar from what we're stuck with in our own society. You know, Americans are not as partisan as they look. I have 300 undergraduates I teach every week. They're not partisan. Our leaders are partisan, right? Not our citizens. The same thing in this region. We need to move toward that. We need to move through these politics, not further entrench these politics. The tragedy of this moment is that it's entrenching the bad behaviors. It's not encouraging the change that we need on all sides, particularly on the Arab and Muslim side. So I'll stop there. I hope that wasn't too much. I went through a lot quickly, but this is a super smart audience, so I know all of you would take that in easily.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. I think it was not too much at all. I thought it was appropriate to give us that broader panoramic view and understanding of how Israel came to be. And so with that, I would pass it off to Jonathan to get some of his comments and perhaps some reaction to what has been shared thus far.
Sure. Thank you. I do have a request because we're going to be, I'm sure asking questions and, having meaningful dialogue. And I know it may be perturbing to some folks, but this is such a serious topic. I'd rather be looking at people rather than just names. So if you're in a position where you could turn on your camera, it would be great to see you. This is not easy stuff to talk about. I know people on both sides. I'm going to show you a picture in a second just to put things in context. First, Jeremy, I thought your overview was, excellent. It's not easy to aggregate so much history and complexity in just a few minutes. And for anybody, no matter what their personal views are, it's not easy. So excellent presentation. I'm not a professor. I do have a BA and an MA in Middle East Studies. I'll just share some things more on a grassroots level. When I was in Israel in 1982, first of all, I'm from Houston, born in Houston, son of a Holocaust survivor. My other side of the family left ran from the Bolsheviks. So people want to know why I'm a centrist, because when you have people that went through the Gulag and you have people that were killed by the fascists, I don't trust the far left. I don't trust the far right. It's called DNA survival, and I like to look at things from the center and go up and down the spectrum. So that's why, kind of on a practical basis, I'm an independent. I also grew up in a household that my mom was a Democrat, Truman Democrat, and my father was Eisenhower Republican. I don't know what the difference is today, given in the world that we live in, but they found differences and they argued like crazy every night with 6 kids sitting around the table hearing them argue. The beautiful thing is, as far as I know, they still slept in the same room every night. And this is why I love the Lyceum, because I've met great friends in the Lyceum. Johnny Sutton, I would consider a great friend. And even though I'm independent, meaning I'm not a liberal Democrat, there are things I agree with Johnny on, and things I don't agree with Johnny on. But I love the guy, and he knows he can call me anytime, which he does. And I know that I can call him anytime, which I'll do as well. And that's okay. So I love the Lyceum. And so part of my message will be on the back end of this. I was in Israel in '82 as a student. I didn't know squat about the area. I literally was tutored one-on-one by a PhD student, literally put out the map, showed me where everything was. I really enjoyed being there at the time. It was an incredible experience. And then Israel went into Lebanon in 1982 in the summer. When I was stressing out about finals, all of my friends were called up, Jewish friends were called up to literally leave finals and go into Lebanon. Israel at that time only had one TV station. Arab citizens of Israel, Palestinian citizens, and poor Israelis and Americans or international folks were the only ones that lived in the dorms. It wasn't chic to live in the dorms at that time. And there was a cafe there where they had one TV station. The guy would roll out the black and white TV. I'm not that old, but it was only one station and pre-cable. And we were watching the reports in Lebanon of Israeli Jews and Palestinians fighting. And I was watching everybody, and it was traumatic because I was only 20 years old and had friends that were called up there. But I was sitting there next to Palestinians who were watching also people they knew, maybe not literally, but figuratively, their family fighting on the other side of the TV. I go, wow, if they're fighting on that side of the TV, we could be fighting on this side of the TV. I mean, it's just one camera on one side and a screen on the other. And one of the guys I was with was an American Jew who moved to Israel, joined the army, would fight in Lebanon during the week and come home on the weekends to protest the war. I mean, that was his life. And he ended up getting killed in that war. And it was really a traumatic thing for me at that stage. And I transferred to Cal Berkeley. And you heard, I would just hear stuff that was incredulous, like you're hearing today from the far left. And I would sought out Arabs from every country to meet with. And this pre-internet browser. So it was very hard to have meaningful discussions because their only source of information was their governments, and the governments are authoritarian governments, so it was bullshit. And then I said, well, wait a minute. 20% of of Israelis are Arabs or Palestinians, citizens, not West Bank, not Gaza, not East Jerusalem, but citizens. They live there. They must know the good, the bad, the ugly. So I learned about a program that was started to bridge the gap. It's called Interns for Peace, like the Peace Corps, but a little more social mission rather than economic missions, maybe. And I like to find things out myself. I like to go to the source. So I joined this program, and was trained in Christian Nazareth, and then lived in a Muslim town called Tira, as Laolu was pointing out. And, when I first moved in, people thought I was CIA, which was kind of funny because I used to have long blonde hair. I was a jock. I don't think I would fit the profile. Not because of physical look. And then later I found out that, people would ask me that all the time. Are you, Shin Bet or CIA? And I go, no, I'm not, but I bet you somebody in this room is. Do y'all want to go around the room? So I learned the culture pretty quick. And I became friends with the U.S. ambassador to Israel, a gentleman named Sam Lewis, who also founded the U.S. Institute for Peace. Sam Lewis he worked for Jimmy Carter, on the Camp David Accords. And he mentored me. I would come in from the village or town I lived in, and I would tell him what was going on in the grassroots, and he would tell me what was going on at the high level politics. And then he encouraged me to go to school at Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies, and they had a program in Jordan. Jordan is a piece of this puzzle because Jordan has a huge population of Palestinians. And so I studied a summer in Jordan. This is now excuse the language. This is a clusterfuck of clusterfucks. This is just unbelievably. We don't even know how this is going to play out. And first, and I agree with Jeremy. And people can say it's biasing. If anybody thinks that what Hamas did is justifiable in any way, check yourself at the door. No. I mean, this was just massacre. And you know who they were massacring? If you go look at who they massacred, liberals, people who believe in a two-state solution, people who think the settlers on the West Bank are nuts, people who were hiring Arabs from Gaza who were going back, and having jobs. Okay, that's what you go look at the geographic. I mean, this is just adds to the complexity of the situation. And I believe, how this is going to play out. Nobody has a clue. Could it be expanded? But I know this in darkness, and it is darkness. One, I have been to, I take shit from a lot of Jews, a lot of Arabs, because I believe in coexistence. And nobody's going to change my mind on that. Now, it's like being a liberal on this call. If you're a liberal or a moderate or a conservative, and you believe in equal justice in America, or you believe in that we should eradicate poverty. If you care, there's a conservative way of solution. There's a moderate. There's a liberal. If you care, and people hide behind issues. Okay, and people hide behind this issue. And now all of a sudden, this issue is supposed to represent everything wrong with the planet. It gets filtered through the American spectrum, so to speak. And this has nothing to do with partisanship of Democrats and Republicans. It becomes partisan. But if you really care about the people on the ground, and I tell people, partisans on both sides, I only care about them. How do we save people's lives over there and people on both sides of the conflict and many sides of the conflict? And how do you create a working prospects or framework where we can make progress, and so we don't go through this cycle? I don't know. And I've been doing this for a long time and still don't know. But I know a few things that, I'm going to continue to pursue. I'm going to show you just 2 to 3 weeks ago in Houston, the board that I sit on, that Laolu mentioned. I sit on a board of the U.S. Friends of Givat Haviva. Okay, 20% of Israelis are Palestinians. 20% of Palestinians are Israelis. Okay, they're the key. They're considered traitors by Palestinians that maybe y'all know from the diaspora or West Bank or Gaza, and Israelis don't trust them either. Okay, they're caught right in the middle. But when I went to Israel a year ago last summer, I went back to the town that I lived in, and I also went to the West Bank. There's some stupid policies on the West Bank that the Israelis do. I mean, it's just a disaster. And guess what? There's stupid policies that the Palestinians do, including the PA, the Palestinian Authority. Okay, terrible leadership gets you only a deeper hole. Okay, and if there's any good thing that could come out of this discussion that we're having today, is most of y'all are in leadership positions, and hopefully most of you are in leadership positions in the Lyceum, because you believe in sitting across the table with people who have different views with you, and you want to work them out peacefully. The Lyceum in our country is one of the few organizations that I know that brings Republicans and Democrats together. It may be the only organization that does that. And I feel like the people in the Lyceum don't squander the time that we have. We have issues in our country that pale in complexity compared to what's going on in the rest of the world. We got JV issues, and we got JV leadership on all sides too that blow it up, and it's about egos as opposed to real policy and solving stuff. And so I would say to everybody here, my first challenge, and I'm happy to answer questions because it's easier to stay focused to answer people's specific questions. And I do want to show you one picture, but don't cruise through the Lyceum. Don't just be here for a resume builder, or if you're corporate for a corporate job, or you need something to do in your life. You have a responsibility, and you have a unique opportunity. One of the few organizations on the planet where it does nothing but bring people together who have different views on a quarterly basis to work them out peacefully over beers or whatever fun stuff, depending on who's the host of the meetings, do. That is unique on this planet. And we have a responsibility, I think all of us, to leverage that and show the rest of the world that people who do have religious, ethnic, socioeconomic differences can come together and work through them. And for some reason, people get along wonderful in the Lyceum, and then all of a sudden, when they're in the office, they don't act that way the same way they do when they're at the retreats. We can do better, and the world is only getting smaller. You don't think there aren't copycats, mass shootings in schools, and all this other kind of stuff. There have to be people in the mosque who are also mentally deranged, not just ideologically sick, but were conned into doing what they were doing. Look at people who get pulled into gangs, and people are desperate. They do stupid stuff, and that are manipulated by brilliant, ideological, evil people. And Jeremy knows all about that because he's a historian. So it's up to the rest of us to turn down the heat, whether you're in business or education, government, and show these younger people there are other ways to solve problems. So one picture, because it's really a moving picture that I'd like to share, and then answer any questions. Can y'all, did it come up yet?
Yeah.
Okay. This is my buddy on the left. I actually do like the guy on the right, even if I don't agree with all his politics. I have tremendous respect for our president. And the buddy, my friend on the left, his name is Mohammed Darwisha. He's an Arab citizen of Israel, lives in a small town near Nazareth. His family has been there 27 generations. He's got a daughter, he's got 4 kids, so 28. He's got a grandson, 29. 29th generation. Mohammed is the director of strategic planning for Gibat Haviva, which is the group that I serve on the board that even before the state was created, has been working on improving Arab-Jewish relations within the region. It focuses primarily today, because there's a state of Israel on citizens. It doesn't deal with the issue of Gaza and the West Bank or East Jerusalem. Doesn't ignore it, but that's not its primary focus. And I texted him last 2 Saturdays ago. As soon as I woke up, I'm on the West Coast right now, and I said, "What the hell's going on?" And he told me that his nephew, Awad, was a paramedic working the concert in the South. As everybody, I'm sure you've heard about the concert that was near Gaza, where 250 people were massacred. The first thing that happened was there were missiles that came over, I think about 6:30 a.m. Israeli time. And people got hurt, and his nephew, and I have another picture, I'm not going to show you, but I have a picture of it because someone took a picture. His nephew was running a tent, like a first aid tent, and was administering first aid to these young Jewish kids. Then the terrorists came in and started killing people, and people ran. And you've seen the videos. And he was encouraged to run by his friends and colleagues. And he didn't. He stayed because one, was helping wounded people, and two, he thought because he was Palestinian that he would be able to talk to these Hamas folks. He spoke fluent Arabic, and he was murdered. And they had to, they weren't just murdered, they couldn't even identify him. They had to do DNA tests from the family didn't know whether he was kidnapped, held as pulled back into Gaza, or whether he was, they couldn't identify. They finally did. And based on his work, he met with President Biden yesterday with other grieved folks. This is a Palestinian stayed in my home 3 weeks ago. We talked about the future for the next 50 years because said if he asked me to be on the board when I met at his home, I was in his home 2 summers ago, and I said, look, we need to build a future for the next generations. We're going to lose people, good people, to the far left and to the far right. They're just gonna check out. They're just gonna I don't relate to people supporting Hamas at these rallies and thinking what they did was justified, and they don't support the right-wing policies of the Israeli government. Guess what? I don't know if you guys watch the news, but hundreds of thousands of Israelis don't support the policies. They were out on the streets protesting weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. I mean, this is the absurdity. They didn't partner with these people. It would be like a radical group. I marched with a George Floyd march in Houston. And it would be like people coming and mowing down these people, the 40,000 people that marched. You're killing the wrong people.
Yeah. You
shouldn't be killing anybody. But so this is crazy, and it takes people who it's going to be crazy on the other side. I met with a Palestinian imam last week. I've been talking. I mean, I had dinner at his house 3 weeks ago. He was a refugee from Syria. His father was a refugee from Israel-Palestine in the 48 war. We had dinner talking about how do we break the cycle before the war. I didn't know what to say to him after what happened. He didn't know what to say to me. He reached out to me. We got together for dinner last week when I was in Houston. We just hugged each other. We knew all hell was going to break loose. And I was giving suggestions on things that we should be doing, whether it's a week, a month, year, or 5 years from now. This could be like COVID. You think it's a week, and then it happened to be 3 years. This could be 3-5 year type deal, but we laid the seeds.
Jonathan, if I could, because I want to bring Jeremy back into the conversation and open it up for larger conversation.
Please.
Just speaking along the lines of, we don't know if this is 3 years, if it's 3 months, if it's 3 weeks. One question that my colleague Brett posed in the chat, which I'll sort of rephrase this way. What from each of your perspectives, and Jeremy, perhaps you weigh in first, are the different potential permutations of what could unfold given the present scenario and all that you've heard around what the different options under consideration are?
It's a great question. I think we have to recognize, first of all, that external actors like the United States, like Egypt, like Iran, can play a role, but we don't control what happens on the ground, right? We can sometimes overstate. And I'm not sure anyone controls Hamas on a day-to-day basis right now, just as there's an Israeli political dynamic at work as well. But I think we are at a crossroad, as President Biden said, and I thought his speech yesterday, by the way, is one of the best speeches a president has given in a long time. I encourage you all to listen to the speech, whether you like him or not. It was a very thoughtful speech, and he made the point that Israel has to take action to secure itself so these sorts of attacks don't happen again. But at the same time, things need to be done to address the concerns that Palestinians, not Hamas, that Palestinians have. And cutting off water and food to mass numbers of citizens is certainly not the way to do that. That's why the United States is providing military aid to Israel and food aid where we can into Gaza. I think some of the first aid is arriving today. So we're at a crossroad. I think it's important for the international community, led by the United States, led by President Biden, to come together to agree that we are going to provide assistance to Israel in defending itself and try to take actions to improve the conditions for those on the ground, to discourage, just as Jonathan was saying so well, to discourage them from going far left or far right, right? That we have to create some other better dynamic on the ground, and there has to be an international effort for that, and this is where the United Nations can be very helpful. Much of the progress that was made between Israel and Egypt in the 70s was with the help of the United Nations. So we need to build a consensus on this. That's really hard work. The Iranians have been bad actors, but they're not going away. We also have to work with them. So this notion that we're going to wag our finger at the Iranians, that doesn't work historically. We have to find a way without empowering the Iranians to do more harm to get them on the side of helping the situation here. The same with the Saudis. If we don't do that, this is the crossroad, right? If we don't do that, I think this is going to escalate. We're at risk of, it's already escalating with Hezbollah getting involved, and this could very easily become a wider war. I'm certain that the president was talking to everyone in the region yesterday about not escalating, but we have to take action so escalation doesn't occur.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jeremy, I appreciate that you said that nobody controls Hamas. Do you think who's pulling the strings on Hezbollah? I mean, meaning I know who's funding them and I know who's training them, but can Iran check Hezbollah, or is Hezbollah going to jump in?
Well, the challenge is, I think in the long run, Iran controls them, but in the short run, it's like the child who lives in your house, right? Who then misbehaves. You're not actually in control day to day. That's the challenge, and
that's right. And I think it's also a lot more. I mean, can any? I see there are African Americans on the call. Can you imagine the civil rights movement in America after 400 years or less than 400, 40 years ago, that if there would have been a movement within the segment of the Black community in America that would have, and horrific things happening throughout the history of the United States, to African Americans or to Latino Americans or Native Americans, people, grieved minorities who have total grievances against them historically. Instead of taking Dr. King's approach, would have just created mass murders around the country. This country would be today. And so I talked to a guy in DC who said there's about, I think, Jeremy, you may have the number, but there was about 15,000, 18,000 Gazan Palestinian workers who had permits to come into Israel.
Yeah, close to 20,000 even. Yeah, you're right.
20,000. Okay. The, two things that I learned yesterday. Now, I don't know if it's true or not. The one thing about the Middle East is that you learn is that whatever we think certain realities are today, 3 months from now, 3 years from now, when people like Jeremy analyze it with full data, the things change a little bit. Okay, so you got to go with the data that you have, but the data may be fluid. There are people who now believe there is just no way this attack, which was so precisely planned, and they had plans and knew everything about certain communities, could have been done without insiders helping them, not Jewish traitors, but it's going to be, I can guarantee you, every one of these communities is going down a list of saying which Palestinian workers from Gaza were working here, and somebody's already going down the list. And so they're not going to have Gazans working in Israel in the next 10 years. I guarantee you that I'd take that bet in a millisecond. So Hamas's favorability today, from what I was told yesterday afternoon, is higher today than before in the Arab world and among Palestinians. I was told, and I don't know if it's true, that half the people who came in from Gaza were not Hamas people. They were people who were jumping in on the action, so to speak. And the point being is that a guy like me, who's been trying to bridge gaps, reconcile, not like policy where Jeremy may write a white paper, on the macro policies, but grassroots work. I'm out of a job, so to speak. Who's going to want to get together other than a few percentages of people for a while? I mean, even my friend, the last time I saw him, we said, I don't know we're going to see each other again. I'll see you on the other side. So there's going to be incredible anger. There's going to be incredible anger on both communities. I do have a prediction, and I may be wrong. I've been wrong about every prediction I've ever made about the Middle East. So here's another one. I think when Israeli Jews, when the war is over, meaning when there's a ceasefire, that anger is going to go towards internal. And if you think millions of people were protesting before and they were doing it rather peacefully, who knows what they're going to do now? And do I have a hope? If we're putting bets on a bingo card, yeah, I'm going to give you a hope. I hope that the moderates in Israel get off their ass, no differently than the moderates in this country, right of center or left of center, and take the keys away from the extremists on their side. And that the government falls, and then a coalition government rules, and they figure out something with Saudi money, Gulf money, where they take what I would call an economic approach and get people back to work on the West Bank and Gaza, quit building these settlements. It's just stupid. It's really stupid. It puts more Jews in harm's way. And Jeremy, just to clarify one thing you said, on a practical basis, I can't give you the stats. You may know the stats better than me. There are two types of quote unquote settlers that live on the West Bank. Okay. They're the fanatics, and I have no apologies of saying that, religious, secular, nationalistic fanatics. Many of them come from Brooklyn. There were Americans that moved there. It's kind of by irony, but it is what it is. You can easily find them. Many evangelicals support these folks. I don't know why. It's just insane. And then you have people who are basically bribed by the government to move there.
Yep.
Because of cheap housing or cheaper housing.
They don't even work. They get an income from the government. I mean, that's
No. I'm talking about a second group.
Okay.
That are living because they got a low interest rate of a new community.
Gotcha.
It's like if y'all are in Houston and somebody's saying, hey, the government's going to give you a discount for living in Sugar Land, hey, I don't mind the 45-minute commute to Tel Aviv or to 20-minute commute to Jerusalem because I got a steal on a house that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
So I don't think they're there for ideological purposes. Some of those folks, they're there because they were bribed to move there.
if I could pivot the conversation a bit, I want to come back to this issue of timing. Jeremy, you made a reference to, um, Israel being on the cusp of potentially normalizing relationships with Saudi, that perhaps being a trigger for Hamas. At the same time, there has to be a recognition that, so let me go back a couple of years in 2020, this historic normalizations of relationships occurred with Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, and the United Arab Emirates, which was a seminal moment, we all thought, in the history of the, dynamics of Middle East peace. Then you're on the cusp of this occurring. So the timing seems curious. However, an attack of this scale and scope just did not seem like something you could have planned in a short window of time. So what are your thoughts about the timing and how this all might have come together? And obviously not neglecting the fact that perceptually Israel had been unstable, if you will, because of all the protests against the judicial reforms that Netanyahu's government was attempting to push through. So your thoughts or reactions to that?
Well, so I mean, here I'll take it back a little bit. It's a great question, Laolu. I don't think that this attack was just a reaction to the movement toward an Israeli-Saudi deal, because, as you said, this was an attack that probably took 2 to 3 years of planning. And there was no talk of an Israeli-Saudi deal more than 9-10 months ago. There was, as you said, the Abraham Accords, a movement toward deals, better relations between Israel and Qatar and other societies, as you pointed out. But I think what the critical shift was that after the Obama administration, after Obama left office, the new administration, largely following the direction of Jared Kushner, basically decided they were going to ignore the Palestinians. They were going to ignore the Palestinians. They were going to try to make a deal between the Israelis and the leaders of other states. And I think the concern for the Palestinians was, if they did not have the United States bringing them into the discussions, Israel would never bring them into the discussions, and their interest would never be served. This was reinforced then by the collapse of the Palestinian Authority, which was the legacy of Yasser Arafat and the PLO. That's the Palestinian Authority. It still exists. Mahmoud Abbas is the leader of that organization. They had been the organization that was always involved in negotiations with Israel. The United States always brought them in. Without their being a party to the negotiations, and with their internal collapse, a more radical element took over, and I think has been planning for years to take more radical action to mobilize other Arabs and to mobilize the US to pay attention. And what Hamas did is horrible, unforgivable. It has no justification, but yet it has partially worked. Because look, we're talking about the Palestinians now. And we didn't talk about them at all during the Trump administration.
Jonathan, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, but I don't even know if Hamas wants a Palestinian state. They want an Islamic state, and if they took over, guess what? They're going to go after Jordan. They're going to go after any other monarchy that they can take over. So I don't know. This is how complex it is, and none of this, what I'm saying, justifies anything that on the other side. It's just, the best complexity of this is, have any of y'all ever messed around with a Rubik's Cube? Those things you do. That's what we're dealing with, and the reality is that nobody's going to be happy which way you turn it, and they're going to be winners and losers in which way. And we're and rational and good people like everybody on this call, although I don't know anybody, you're in Lyceum, who want to solve this fairly, equitably, whatever that means, even if we each have differences of opinion of what fairness is and what's equitableness. we still have a range, right? That thing on the Rubicon cube we don't know where that is. You know, it used to be two-state solutions, two-state solution that, you know, everybody agreed that that's the only solution. We didn't know how to get there. The only problem in the world where you know what the solution is, nobody knows how to get there. I don't know if that's a reality anymore. I was with a peace guy 2 years ago. I mean, he's negotiated between Israel and Hamas.
So speaking of that two-state solution, where would you say we are? Have we made progress in the last 20 years? I mean, you think about the era when Yasser Arafat was leader of the Palestinian Authority. From that point to now, have we regressed? Has there been progress?
We've regressed.
The day that Yitzhak Rabin was killed, assassinated by an Israeli Jew, is probably, I don't know, Jeremy, you look at things more historically, but I think that was the day that are one of the days that things fell apart. And you know, and then Bibi Netanyahu came to power. And Jeremy, you said something that I wrote down that I agree with you, but I think there's another statement there, and I think that's important for people to learn here. If I understood you correctly, I'm just paraphrasing. You know, Netanyahu wouldn't be prime minister without the settlers. You know, coalition government. Okay, guess what? He wouldn't have been prime minister if the Arab citizens of Israel would have come out in full force to vote. Okay, so I'm a guy that says in this country, if you don't like, you know, people died for the right for people to vote, and a lot of people don't vote because they don't think it matters. As flawed as democracies are, our country is Israel, as flawed as it is, you still have elections. And elections have consequences. And there was consequences in the last election. And so when people think that their vote doesn't matter, it does, because historically, people like Jeremy go back and analyze things and go, oops, you know, if these people over here would have voted, it would have been a little different. So I think that's an important lesson for people here in the U.S. And then I also think that the lines, you know, as you already said, the nobody would have dreamt that people would have the Saudis would have been on the verge of recognizing Israel and the Gulf states with the Abraham Accords. Things change, and that also means that alliances within the pro-Israel community and pro-Palestinian community should change, you know, and that's important, and that's an opportunity here. I grew up. Go ahead, Laolu.
Yeah, I think Jeremy was responding to. He was going to say he felt we have regressed since then, and because I want to.
Unequivocally, the regressed. Look at the number of people who have every year that Israel keeps building settlements on the West Bank. I mean, it's just stupid. It's stupid.
So I think that the assassination of Rabin was a big deal, but we should remember also that at the end of the Clinton administration, we were close to a two-state solution, right? Clinton brought Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat to Camp David. He was trying to recreate the Camp David Accords of the late 70s. And they were pretty close to a deal that would have actually created more of a functioning Palestinian state. Arafat did not accept the deal because he didn't get everything he wanted, and he was afraid he'd be killed when he went home. And this is an important point to raise because many will say that Israel has been too hardline and has not offered to negotiate, and that has been true since then. But it was not true at that moment. Yeah. The Palestinians missed an important opportunity. Clinton devoted, I mean, if you read his memoir, you know, devoted 2 weeks of his life as president. That's an enormous amount of time of a president to come that close. And the deal would have been far better for the Palestinians than what they had afterwards. But Arafat was afraid of his right flank.
Well, and Jeremy, I'll say one other thing. If all the Arab countries that recognize Israel today would have gotten behind Oslo then, it may have been a tipping point to put pressure on Arafat with a bribery of money to put billions of dollars of investments.
Yeah. And I want to say that that's actually one of the real tragedies here. I mean, the biggest tragedy immediately is all the innocents who have died in Israel and elsewhere. And Jonathan talked about this very eloquently. That's got to be the top of our list, the top of our grieving. But the Palestinian people, I'm not talking Hamas here, the actual people, the 2 million people in Gaza, they have been so consistently poorly served.
That's right.
By their leaders, by the other Arab states. I mean, one of the reasons Egypt won't open that border is the Egyptians don't want them. And it's a real tragedy, and this is not going to get fixed. And it can't just be the US that fixes, but the international community has to address that issue. We can't just say, I was talking to someone earlier and they said, well, it's the fault of all the Palestinian people because they don't overthrow Hamas. That's like saying it's the fault of the Russian people that they don't overthrow Putin. Right? The Hamas was elected 17 years ago. They've not had another election. The Palestinian people did not elect them. Jonathan's right. Israel has elections. Israel's a democracy. There are no elections for Palestinian leadership. And we can't just sit by and think this is going to be fixed by allowing the continual poor leadership in the Palestinian space. We have to, as a community, help the Palestinians get self-government. That's what Clinton and Barack and Arafat refused to do. That's what Clinton and Barack were trying to do.
Yeah, and I would argue, as I did with Mohammed when he stayed with us, Mohammed, you're a unique individual, amazing individual, but we have to train 1,000 other Mohammeds.
Exactly.
And so we need a lyceum for Israeli Jews, Palestinians to have off the record dialogue, projects that they do quietly, together, not when it's sensationalized. It's not any different than probably anybody, if it was up to me in the Lyceum, I would make it a requirement that when you become a director, you are paired with the most politically, socially divergent person that you could possibly be with. And you're stuck with that person, and they're stuck with you for your 6 years in the Lyceum, so that you learn how to build those bridges, so to speak. And that's a parallel that's going to need to happen, I think, in the Middle East, that we need, and Americans can help do that.
Absolutely.
Look how diverse this call is, not just politically, but socially, economically, ethnically, geographically around Texas, that we need to believe that is valuable, and that we can teach them how to structure organizations like this, facilitate those things. Even the Lyceum could help pull Israelis and Palestinians together who are more sophisticated to have policy discussions in private, not showboating or talking to their constituents, but behind the scenes, no differently than people in the Lyceum who talk to each other off record, who are in public office or lobbying or whatever, do the same thing. Those are skills that need to be taught. No one's just born knowing how to do these things. And we can contribute to that in a small but meaningful way.
Certainly. We've got 10 minutes left. I want to go to a question in the chat, then come back to another question on the politics. So there's an article in the chat about some skirmishes on the northern border with Hezbollah. Houthis were firing cruise missiles into Yemen. Some were intercepted by the U.S. Navy. There's a concern that are these early signs of escalation, or are people just taking advantage of the vacuum that's been created with everyone's attention now turned towards Israel?
No, I think this is escalation. And unfortunately, you had asked me before, Laolu, your excellent question about, what are the different options? Unfortunately, the most probable outcome is that this will escalate, that this will not remain contained. And we have to do everything we can. Everyone who's a rational actor has to do everything they can to restrain this. But if you think about it from the perspective of the Houthi or Hezbollah, this is their opportunity to get in on the fight. This is their opportunity to show their supporters that they're as radical as Hamas. What you have is a phenomenon. I mean, look, you're seeing this within the Republican Party in Congress right now. When you get into a crisis, there becomes an incentive to just keep escalating to show that you're a true believer. And unfortunately, that's the process. It's much worse, of course, in the Middle East that we've fallen into right now. And we need to step in. And I think this is what Biden was doing. One of the reasons Biden went there was to try to bring cooler heads to all sides, right? And encourage, incentivize. Honestly, sometimes you got to pay people off to bring the temperature down. But I'm really worried about this expanding on the northern border and beyond.
Yeah, I don't think it's paranoid, whoever typed that in. I think it's a valid concern. And it's you know, I've read a lot about, I'm sure Jeremy has read a lot about the 73 war. Yep. Martin and Nick just came out with a book on Kissinger, the shuttle.
I reviewed it for the Times, actually. I wrote a long review of it for the New York Times. It's a very good book.
Yeah, I probably read your review and just didn't know it was you. And you know, it's interesting. I had a roommate who was a survivor of the 73 war. I think it was 2,200 Israelis were killed in a week.
Yep.
Most of the people in his platoon were killed. And, you know, he was like a Vietnam, one of these Vietnam vets. He had PTSD, he did drugs and afterwards, and just, you know, he had survivor's guilt.
Yep.
And then you read the book and you go, you know, the whole damn thing could have been prevented if they just would have negotiated, because they ended up where they just went full circle to.
So this is the point. I just want to underline this point because I think you said it really well, Jonathan. You know, leadership. I mean, Lyceum is about leadership training, right? I train leaders at the university and work with lots of groups. Leadership training is not about pouring fire or more gas onto a flame. Leadership is about calming things down. Now, it doesn't mean both sides are equal. Hamas did things that went well beyond the pale, well beyond anything Israel has done. That has to be acknowledged, and Israel has a right to apprehend and undertake law enforcement operations as we would. But leadership means not encouraging a wider war. That's an important message, and we need to be leading not just by doing it ourselves, by getting all of our allies, different relationships, right? It's a matrix of relationships here, and we need to get everyone sending that message. That's real leadership. I don't understand the sort of cult of violence and this sort of stuff. Historically, that's a disaster.
Well, and one thing that you know, George Bush did after 9/11 was encourage all Americans not to assume every Muslim is terrorist. Okay.
He went to a mosque. He gave a speech a week later in the largest mosque in Washington, D.C. and said that. And it was exactly that's leadership.
Netanyahu hasn't had that moment, and he's not going to have that moment, and that makes it more complex because if you don't have a leader saying, look, there also are innocent people, not because it's just a footnote, but because 20% of people in Israel are Arabs or Muslims, you're going to see, as we've already seen, you may not see it on the news, but if you watch Israeli news, you know, extremist Jews in Israel try to stir the pot and create havoc just inside Israel with Arabs, no differently than the extremist Arabs want to create havoc and create a second front, third front war. So
President Biden, as we talked about before, echoing Bush to some extent, said in his speech yesterday, again, I advise everyone to watch, he said clearly, all Palestinians are not Hamas, just as George W. Bush said all Muslims are not Al-Qaeda. Netanyahu, as far as I know, has never said that.
That's right.
And that's a real problem.
Duly noted, great point there. If we go back to Netanyahu, can you describe the current political circumstances that are ongoing? There was a colleague of mine on the call who I was talking with last week, and I expressed that while, you know, it was like I left Houston, I was in Nigeria, and in that 10-day period, We fired the speaker, and a bunch of these other things happened. And people overseas were a lot more concerned about the fact we didn't have a Speaker of the House, because in other countries, you have a non-functional government because the speaker is the head of parliament for most of those. But we weren't quite as concerned. In Israel, currently, you had sort of this divided government. At one point, it was the liberals had won plurality. They formed the government that got dissolved about a year ago. Netanyahu came back, and it was like it wasn't all quite structured. So what do the politics stand? Obviously, we know that they've come together under a unified government for the purpose of the emergency at hand. But can you comment on that and what the future political dynamics potentially could be in Israel going forward in the near term?
By every measure, Netanyahu is even more unpopular than he was when the war started. There's a lot of concern that he's responsible to some extent for letting Israel's guard down. Also, he was actually aiding Hamas for a while because he was trying to divide the Palestinians. So there's a lot of anger toward Netanyahu, and you're seeing this in newspapers like Haaretz and other things. And Netanyahu is trying to rally people by being a tough guy. It's the common thing that people go back to. And the unity cabinet is not really a unity cabinet, right? They're kind of agreeing to hold their fire on each other for a while. But another prediction that can be made is within a few weeks, we're going to see probably this government collapse. And I don't know if they're going to have a caretaker government or an election, but don't think this unity government will last very long, because as soon as people start asking why this happened, you're going to see the divisions deepen. So Netanyahu's in a very weak position, and that worries me because leaders in weak positions tend to overreact.
Yeah, and to complement that or add to it, just as one example. There are a lot of questions as to where was the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and there have been reports that, well, a lot of the people who usually are there were on the West Bank protecting settlers on the West Bank, and so people in those areas are going to, if that is true, that resources were moved from within the state to the territories, the West Bank territory, and therefore security was lapsed. There are going to be a lot of angry people. But I don't, it's when you're passionate about the topic like I am, you learn, unfortunately, what I hope will happen is not necessarily what's going to happen. I would have hoped that the Republicans, seeing that Israel was asleep at the wheel at a crisis, that they would hurry up and get a Speaker of the House, because the first thing that I asked after I got some bearings, if the Israelis were asleep at the wheel, what are we vulnerable to? What are we sleeping at the wheel? Now, I'm sure our intelligence, if they were, woke up real quick. But the point is that, we all ask us. I ask myself and my life partner every day when she says, I say, this is a really stupid world. And then we turn off the TV and then we say, okay, what are we doing that may be stupid that we're not aware of yet, that we'd say it's stupid after it happened, and so I don't know how the Israelis are going to react. I wrote down some notes. I have a friend who's very politically astute, like Jeremi. He's in D.C., and he said this when I was on a call with him. He said, political Zionism is dead. And he's not a left-winger. He worked for AIPAC for 25 years. He said, the goal of a state, going back to Jeremy's point, is to deter.
Yes. Yes.
They weren't deterred. The second goal is to defend. They didn't defend. The third goal is to defeat. They haven't defeated these folks. And then there's redemption. And, so I don't know where we go. And, again, I'm repeating myself on things, but when I have issues that are too
Jonathan, I hate to do this.
Yeah.
We're out of time. So if you could just have some some concluding remarks. We'll give Jeremy the same opportunity. And if anyone is just burning to say something, they can as well. And then we have to wind down the time, unfortunately.
No, my takeaway with all this, particularly with everybody on the call who are in leadership positions, is time is not on anybody's side. I mean, and so don't squander the roles that you have or the power that you have in the influence that you have, whatever you do to make a difference, whether you're in business or government or education. It's a selfish reminder that if we're not in the middle of it over there or any place else, and we can still think rationally, what can we each do on a micro level to make more of a difference in the world, wherever we are in the world? And that's my takeaway.
Yep. So I have 3 points I've been repeating to all the groups I've talked to, and particularly to my students, right? So I'll just repeat them quickly here. First, don't make the problem worse. When people use language, friends of yours on both sides, that make things worse, correct them. I had a long conversation with a member of Congress who said that we had to eradicate Palestinians. I'm a supporter of Israel as he is. You don't eradicate a people. You eradicate cockroaches. You don't eradicate a people. But then I've also had students of mine who say Israel is a fascist country. That's not true either. You don't call a democracy a fascist country, right? Syria is a fascist country. Israel isn't. We have an obligation in our communities to educate and correct people, because this kind of language, as it lingers, it makes things worse, right? So that's one thing. Make things better, not worse, at least in your community. Educate people around you. You won't accept people saying racist things. Don't accept them saying that in this context. Second, the best thing for the region is if American democracy is strong and vibrant. What's going on in Congress right now is distracting us. Our members of Congress are not able to do their work, and we could talk about that in many parts of our democracy. A stronger, more vibrant, well-functioning American democracy is the best thing for this region. When we've got our cylinders working at home, we're better prepared to do things abroad. So that's the second thing that's going to become an issue. Tonight, President Biden is going to ask for Congress to pass an aid package for Israel and Palestine. They can't pass an aid, it'll pass the Senate, but they can't pass one in the House till they have a speaker, right? So we got to get our democracy in order. Nothing is better overseas until we pay attention to what, So I tell my kids, you got to clean your room first before you go out and conquer the world, right? And then the third point, and maybe the most important one, this is just what Jonathan said so well. Reach out to people who have a different perspective from you and encourage others to reach out to people. There's so much ignorance. This is a part of the world where many Americans have strong opinions and very little knowledge. And that doesn't seem to dampen the strong opinions, but we can all fix that. We all know people who have connections to this region. I mean, this is why I agreed immediately when Laolu contacted me. I think it's my job to help communities understand these issues better and find people who see it differently. So don't just, if you're a Jew like me, don't just talk to other Jews. And if you're a Muslim, don't just talk to, we've got to start building conversations. I think this was actually Jonathan's point. And I think it's so strong, and you can start doing that. This is what I'm telling my students. Don't just go to the Jewish Student Union, to Hillel. I go there too. Don't just go there. Go to where some of the Palestinian students are and talk to them. Build relationships. And I know,
Jeremy, I would add one other thing. If you're not tied to either of the two communities, then the role you can play is to facilitate bringing people together, regardless whether you have an opinion or you don't know anything about the issue, but you can still facilitate the people who are passionate about it on both sides. And that's a great service to the conflict by getting other people to come together. They're not going to agree, but at least they start a dialogue. And you can help facilitate that because you're kind of what I would call maybe a neutral party, but playing a very critical role.
Well said. Very well said.
With that, I want to thank you both again for taking the time. Thank colleagues for joining in this important discussion, and wish everyone a good evening and a hopefully enjoyable weekend ahead. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for organizing us, Laolu. Thank you.